So, Owen, thank you so much for joining us on GB News Originals. You were at a conference in Brussels this week discussing the prospect, potentially, of a civil war in Europe, but not in the way that we would historically think about it, more in terms of potentially people that have lived in our continent for hundreds of years, have ancestors there, and, relatively newcomers, people that have come maybe in the last 100 years. One of your co-panellists was Dr. David Betts at the King's College London. Originally, when he started talking to media, he was saying that maybe there was a 20% chance of a civil war in the next 5 years in Europe. In his speech at the conference, he basically said that he feels that it's inevitable. And one of the countries that he believes it could kick off in is your home country of Ireland. But when you spoke, you were slightly more circumspect than that. So would you tell us why?
Yeah, well, first of all, good morning. Thanks for having me. It was a very interesting conference. It was interesting to hear David's perspective that he believed it would happen in Ireland, and I can understand it. Yes, my view was somewhat different. I broke it down into what we have seen and what we know versus, I think, what a lot of the panellists were, they were kind of war gaming it out into the future, looking at the structural issues that might eventually lead. But I think that we have somewhat concrete evidence from Ireland, and that's because up until 2024, we had 31 fires at International Protection Services accommodation, so IPAS centres. This is where the government redistribute migrants around the country. So this is unimaginable in my lifetime, that we could reach a point where the government and local communities came to such an impasse that we would see local communities literally fight back against the government. So just to give your listeners a little bit of context on what's happening there, for the past 25 years, there's been essentially an open borders, a de facto open borders policy enacted in Ireland. We've had, since the Celtic Tiger, our major economic boom in the early 2000s, we've had rampant abuse of the asylum claimant system. So in 2004, we already had our Justice Minister telling us that we had 90% of international protection claimants were bogus claims. And the government didn't grasp, the nettle by the stem at that time. No mass deportations followed. And what happened is that Ireland became a soft touch. And so year on year, we had this massive rise in false claims up until 2023, we were talking between 2022 and 23, we had nearly 30,000 claims alone, which is a massive number of claims for Ireland. But again, in 2025, we had that reconfirmed by our Prime Minister, Micheál Martin, that the vast majority of these were yet again bogus. But no mass deportations followed. Now, the big problem with all of this is that the government pursued a very ruthless policy of redistributing all of these people who people knew were bogus claimants around the country. They were bussed into small communities, often of 300, 400, 500, 1,000 people, ancient communities all along the west coast in particular, often in the dead of night. And they pursued this no veto, no consultation policy, meaning that the local communities had no choice in the matter. That they often didn't even know that these buses of individuals were coming, and they were just put into their communities, often in night buses, and people would wake up and their ancient communities were completely changed demographically. And so what happened is that this led to a standoff between several communities along the west coast and the government refused to back down, and so these IPAS centres began to burn. Now, if we think about Northern Ireland, okay, with a history of conflict, you might say, okay, that's the Irish being, being a bit crazy. But this is the Republic of Ireland, which is very pastoral, very peaceful. Since our Civil War period and our War of Independence period, there's been nothing like this. So this is a new line in the sand. So what I would say is that, yes, definitely, we will see mass civil unrest with the potential to spill out into something worse if the government continues this policy. Now, they have backed off it since a lot of these fires. In particular, there was mass riots last December after an African asylum seeker allegedly raped a 10-year-old girl who was in state care on the grounds of Ireland's biggest migrant centre up in Dublin, the City West Hotel, that exploded into riots. And I think that shocked the government. They talked big. They kept talking in a very authoritarian manner that, you know, nobody's going to get a choice in the matter. But they have, they're still continuing to push these individuals into communities, but they're doing it in a more stealthy fashion, I would say. So they understand that there is a new line and there's a new contract. That is that they overstepped. They suspended the democratic method, if you will, by forcing people's backs to the wall, and people responded fierily. So I would say that is a definite line in the sand. There will be civil unrest with the potential to spill into something more if the government continue to do this. Now, where I disagree maybe with David, who did a terrific presentation as well, is that he was, looking at Ireland as maybe somewhere that could kick off a widespread kinetic civil war. But my issue with that is that we're actually quite, despite our fearsome reputation, particularly amongst Irish Americans as the fighting Irish and all that, we're actually quite a docile people. And we, our maybe, if you want to go far back, throughout the centuries, under colonialism, we always had to, after every failed rebellion, all of our fighting men were, scooped up and sent off to the continent, and they would go off to fight for Spain and the other various Catholic dynasties of the time. And then a lot of our most virile went to North America, of course, as well. But let's bring it up to the present, the problem. And this is where I see the major problem. If you're wargaming a situation like this, since the foundation of the state, now the Irish, and particularly the Irish government, when it suits them, they like to, it's very easy to blame the Brits for everything. But here's the reality about economic problems. But here's a reality. Since the foundation of the state in the 1920s, over 1 million Irish people have immigrated. You can't blame the Brits for that. That's down squarely on the shoulders of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, our big two political parties. Anytime there's an economic crisis, so like in the 1950s when we attempted to a very protectionist model, again in the 1980s when we responded poorly to global recession, and again after the collapse of the Celtic Tiger in 2010, masses and masses of young virile Irish people were forced out. And the problem with this is that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, our two big parties, understand that having this tradition of immigration in our culture is a great economic release valve, but it's also a great anger release valve. So every time they mess up, every time they blow up the economy, every time they go against the will of the people, they understand that our youngest, our most, as I say, most virile, most angry, are going to just immigrate to Australia, Britain, Canada, America. And that's what's kept them in power to a certain degree for decade after decade, is that our angriest always go abroad. And if you are to war game then, as Professor Betts is doing, a situation where you believe civil war is coming, I think that's a very strong mark against the Irish leading it. Now, I do believe that the Irish are great followers. If you just look at how our country has changed in 25 years, we learned nothing from our European neighbours like yourselves there in Britain, like France, Germany and so on, where there terrible mistakes were made in immigration policy over decades, allowing masses of individuals from the same culture and allowing them to create micro-communities in nations, which just, prevents on any meaningful integration. Well, we went down that route much later, having all that data to hand. So we are followers, at least our political class are followers. And so I do believe that if there was a massive unrest or something to break out, that like many other countries, there's a certain cohort of the Irish who would just be waiting for that spark.
But there might not be anywhere to go. As you say, the whole of the West has kind of pursued the same policy. And one that seems particular to the British Isles is this idea of putting them all in hotels at the taxpayer expense. And, when they talk about civil war potentially coming to pass, people have in their brains the idea of maybe people rebelling against the government or immigrant communities versus native communities. But one theatre of conflict that you talked about, which I think was quite interesting, is the new elite that have been created, the hoteliers, the resentment that could be breeded between, amongst people that are living in those communities. Could you talk a little bit about that? How actually taking these hotels and filling them full of migrants has decimated local tourism economies and breeds resentment.
Oh, absolutely. So what happened in our situation, and I'm sure, it was paralleled in Britain to a degree as well, is that after the war started between Russia and Ukraine in earnest in 2022, we took in a massive amount of Ukrainian refugees. It was as I said at conference, our Wir schaffen das, our Merkel moment where, the country just got behind it and said, we're going to do this. We're going to help out a neighbour in need. And it was a wonderful, came from a wonderful place, a wonderful motivation. But it was totally impractical. The government had no apparatus to deal with it. They had no beds to put them in. And so what they did was, exactly as you said, they started this policy of commandeering beds from private supply and from hoteliers, and particularly down the west coast of Ireland, which is overwhelmingly dependent on tourism for survival. So the first thing that happened was that the government up through 2023, as they invited Ukrainians in, they were offering them €232 per week on top of other benefits, accommodation, food, education, etc., etc. But this was way, way, way above the European average. So Hungary, for example, were offering they were offering just under €14 per week, for example, as a survival, and the average was €100. So what ended up happening is we got 10 times per capita the amount of Ukrainians that any other European country was getting by 2023. We had over 100,000 Ukrainians by the start of 2024, which is massive for tiny Ireland. We're now up to 5.25 million people, but that's with 1 million people born overseas. The actual Irish population is 4 million. So to add 100,000 Ukrainians was an extraordinary number. But to deal with this, the government essentially bribed these hoteliers. They offered, contracts way, way, way above what they could ever expect to earn in multiple years of tourism. And so what happened is that most hoteliers, when offered, just simply couldn't refuse the money being thrown at them. And it led to almost 30%, 29% of all beds outside of Dublin were commandeered by the government and taken away from tourism. It had a profound effect on local tourism. So first of all, I should say that, 2.1 billion was paid out in 2023 to these hoteliers and accommodation providers, making these unimaginably wealthy overnight. So we created this new class, a hotelier class, in these ancient communities.
That's a huge amount of money relative to Ireland's size. I think in the UK we spend 8 billion a year, and our economy must be like at least 10, 20 times the size.
Well, on paper, we're extremely rich, as we're told, because of American foreign direct investment, but there's no trickle down. In these communities, this kind of injection of cash is very real and massive. And of course, it creates a conflict, as you said, between people. But there was the other side to it, you see, which is not, as they removed these beds from communities, these hoteliers became extraordinarily wealthy. But all of the satellite industry surrounding tourism, so, tour guides, restaurateurs, pubs, bus companies, they all went bust because there was no tourists there. And there was a breakdown of the tourist spend by the Irish Tourism Board, and they found that 31% of a spend on a holiday is only spent on accommodation. 69% is spent in the locality on these other walking around things. And so all of these went bust overnight. So there was this extraordinary resentment where the tourism industry was shattered, yet you had the hoteliers made arbitrarily rich, unimaginably rich, whereas the rest lost it. So we first had this extraordinary tension within ancient community, or within tourism communities and tourism dependent communities who have been for decades dependent. But then the second form of tension which came in was that after this initial wave of Ukrainians started to be cycled out into private accommodation in 23 and 24, local communities were told and believed from their local politicians that they were going to get their hotels back, they were going to get their lives back, and they would get their tourism industry back. But what started to happen was that the government started cycling in all of these bogus claimants from Africa and other Arab nations. So the people had signed up to allow in legitimate war refugees from the Ukraine, and in many cases what they got were bogus claims of mainly men who were completely unvetted from Africa and Arab nations. So we had two levels of strain. We had this tension between native and outsider, and as you rightly say, between new classes created internally. So it was a profound reshaping of these small communities, which of course breeds resentment.
And in Britain, I mean, every poll shows that the majority of Brits are opposed to mass immigration. They want immigration brought down. Before we kind of get into the politics of it, I just wondered if you could talk to me a little bit about how that falls in Ireland. Is there a majority against this mass migration model, or is it a little bit more balanced or actually pro?
In Ireland, we have a uniquely powerful NGO sector that, okay, the official number is 36,000, but it's more like 11,000 when you take out, things like local sports groups and schools and all that, which fall in under this umbrella. But a lot of these are founded since the turn of the millennium. Again, this is... it touches a little bit on the sociology, but that we had a profound collapse in faith in Ireland around the turn of the millennium as a series of reports came out about church sexual abuse scandals. We had a profound collapse in the church, and into the vacuum, they were the chief custodians of the NGO sector in Ireland, but into that vacuum came a new and heavily social justice theory-driven elite, this NGO sector, and they have been incredibly vocal, incredibly left-wing, but also they have managed to create a wedge between the government and the electorate whereby their voice is amplified and the voice of the native people is very much drowned out. We had a Fine Gael, so they're a ruling party, a minister of theirs who retired 2 years ago, a long-time serving minister. He said he was a backbencher at this time, but he said on retiring dejectedly, he told the Irish Times that he would have had more power as a middle-ranking NGO manager than he did as a government backbencher. So that gives you a sense of the power of these NGOs. Now, they're extremely left-wing and pro-open borders, but the people of Ireland, like in Britain, are absolutely not. Poll after poll after poll shows that at least 70% of people believe that we've allowed in too many immigrants into Ireland, and people want a reduction in that. So we have a profound, just like the forcing of people into these communities, we have again a profound steamrolling of the democratic process in this regard, whereby this NGO sector, who have inserted themselves between the government and people, willingly, happily by the government, I should say, they're very much complicit in that. They're the ones funding them, after all, with taxpayer money. That again has created another element whereby the democratic process has broken down, which again is another step towards civil conflict or civil war.
And in Britain and other countries around Europe, this anger, the disconnect between the elites and the people has kind of given way to some new parties coming up, trying, the political entrepreneurs trying to use this disdain for the elite to try and push through the will of the people. But in Ireland, you're not really seeing much representation of this sentiment, are you?
It's a strange one, you're right. We're a bit of an outlier there, and that was very clear at this conference that we both attended this week, is that I was very impressed by the Sweden Democrats and the apparatus that they have there, not just the fact that they're in government, the second largest party at the moment in Sweden. They have a supply and demand, situation in there, but they have a very deeply rooted youth branch and things like this. In Ireland, we're a million miles away from this. So a report came out. Well, in my own book, Vandalising Ireland, I put together a review of all of the party manifestos before the last general election at the end of 2024. And I found that essentially all Irish political parties are left-wing. If you look at their actions over the course of the past couple of governments, and if you look at their party offerings and inner manifestos, and this was reaffirmed, which, you know, I appreciate as well. It's always good to see that by a major study after the general election that was carried out by UCD, it called How Ireland Voted in 2024. Again, they compared all the party manifestos and found that every major party and micro-party to that point, essentially, was left-wing. So Irish politics ranged from centre-left to extreme left. So we have a situation where our big two parties, who, you know, they fall into the, you know, Labour conservative system that you would have there in Britain, and we have the same problems with them. That is that they're more globalist parties. They're more interested in maybe big finance than actually the concerns of local native people, and they are working in concert with the far left, because the far left in Ireland, particularly the major opposition party Sinn Féin, they like open borders for ideological purposes because they're left-wing socialist. The Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the globalist parties, like open borders because it supports cheap labour and it supports the Irish foreign direct investment economy that they've built. So there's an alignment there of the hard left and the centre and these two major parties. So over the past decade, that has dragged these two traditional centrist parties more and more and more and more left. Excuse me. But to your point, that what's happening in Ireland to counter that? Well, very little so far. It's been a major problem. Now, we do have two new parties who have sprang up, A&2, who are a splinter. They were an offshoot of Sinn Féin. Now, their economic policy remains quite left, but they're more socially conservative. They're strong on abortion, women's rights, and things like that. And then there's Independent Ireland, who are they were a collective of independent politicians who would be mainly rural conservatives, and they tried to come together under one umbrella, just again to try and leverage some power. So now it is interesting that these two parties together command about 10%. They're getting close to 10% together, and if they work together with independents, they can do something. But we're still quite far behind in terms of our evolution of having a proud and loud, say, populist party like Reform, or in Britain there, or the new party, with Rupert Lowe's his new party,
Restore, yeah.
Restore, exactly, like either of these. We have nothing like that taking off right now. And there's two reasons for that, I suppose. The main one being that anyone who, in Ireland, you know, everyone very often in the anti-establishment scene likes to say, oh, the media is bought out by the government, you know, but in Ireland, it's literally true. There isn't a single media conglomerate in Ireland who can survive without government intervention, very clearly. So in the first case, they have VAT completely removed, while other industries like hospitality are struggling and shedding jobs. In the second place, the best job that a journalist can get in Ireland is as a government advisor. So if you play your cards right as a political commentator, you're going to get the call up to the big leagues as a government advisor, where you're going to get paid far more than anything you can as an editor, and have better job security as an editor in a newspaper. And the biggest one being that every government, and again in the book Vandalising Ireland, I look into the finances of each of the media conglomerates, and there's three. There's Bauer, based in England. There's Media Who is based in Belgium, who own a huge percentage of the Irish media landscape, and there's the Irish Times Trust, and they own radio, newsprint and website between them, the vast majority, and local papers. But all of them have over-leveraged, extremely over-leveraged, and they're turning losses very often annually, and they'll do well to break even. And so they're completely reliant on grants from the in particular Cohesion na Man, that's the Irish government regulator, the media regulator. Now they offer a series of grants that 5,000-10,000 euro per round, but these are the margins that between failure and success in Ireland, keeping a business afloat. But this is just hands-off editorialising by the government, because this Cohesion na Man is heavily ideologically driven. It's if you look through their mission statement, it's again steeped in social justice theory, and the money that they hand out in grants for programs and shows and research, they're all following the government line on gender, ideology, on climate, on the denial of populism, stamping out populism. So the government can say, hey, we have one of the freest presses in Europe, but the reality is that they completely finance this. And if these government, and I checked, there isn't a single story or documentary that has won money from these grants that have deviated from the government line in any way. So it is very clearly the case that the media in Ireland is bought by the government, and so the knock-on effect of that is that anyone who tries to pop up to the right of the government is very clearly and quickly labelled in the national media as far-right, Nazi, the usual, slurs and labels. It doesn't matter what the party manifesto is. It doesn't matter, what the intentions of the individual coming up is. So that is a huge problem in Ireland, more so than other countries. Say, take Britain, for example, there, because of just your mass population, you have this diverse, I know not as diverse as you would like, and you guys are doing phenomenal work there at GB News in trying to bring an independent perspective to the news. But we have nothing like that in Ireland because, again, that's a big problem, is our size. It's very easy to capture our institutions ideologically. So we have, 5-6 universities, all completely captured by social justice theory, because these guys are all going to the same conferences. They're all, sharing similar ideas. So it works against us, our size. But the biggest thing that's working against us is that the government is very strategically investing our taxpayer money in things that do not benefit us, in fact, in things that harm us.
And the way that plays out is from an outsider's point of view. I mean, I'm not, an expert in Irish politics by any means, but sometimes I watch press conferences and I see clips. It's a uniquely arrogant political elite. I mean, the way that they respond to journalists who ask difficult questions, they shut them down, they refuse to answer. Sometimes they even insult journalists. And you would think maybe this could work in more authoritarian or larger society where there's this huge gap between the people and the elite. But Ireland's a tiny country with a tiny population. You would think that they wouldn't be able to get away with this distance.
Yeah. Well, I think you put your finger on it just perfectly right there, is that we expect these big gaps between the people in authoritarian countries, but we do have it. It's just softer. It's just quieter. It's just more, as I said, one of the big ways they've done it is to inject this NGO sector between the electorate and government. So whenever the government wants to push through some unpopular policy, they will get experts from the NGO sector who will come on to news shows which are paid out by the government or can't survive without government investment, and they'll have a nice conversation that supposedly shows all of the perspectives, which don't. They show every perspective from centre left to far left, and so there's a very controlled way. The narrative is very cleanly controlled in Ireland, and that's controlled because the government is able to give the illusion of discussion and democratic democratic discussion by bringing in voices that are captured by them already, and putting these on national television screen. But as we said, that when push comes to shove, they show their colours. So when it comes to resettling migrants, they push those into neighbourhoods and say, you're going to take this, tough luck, which has resulted in violence. This gentleman, as I pointed to, who just retired recently from government, who said there's no point, essentially, in Irish democracy anymore, that if I, a backbencher, don't have a voice in government policy ahead of NGOs, well, what chance does Joe Public have? You don't. So there is this very skillful separation of the political elite and the electorate, and they have, again, a lot of it's to do with size, because the media elite of the national media, these NGO heads, the foreign direct investment heads, so for the massive companies like Google, Amazon, Meta, X, all of these are political class, they're all living in the same small neighbourhoods in Dublin, and, which is our only power hub, in Ireland. And so it is a very, 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 very small elite. And they're very much, to be crude, huffing each other's farts. If you want a good example of it, just turn on the radio any day, the Irish National Radio, and when we're having political discussions. And whereas 20 years ago you were likely to have some dissenting voices, or you were likely to have, a man on the street having room to put in his opinion. Now what you're more likely to see is journalists interviewing other journalists, or the same roster of far-left politician to centre-left politician. There is no diversity of thought. It's a very small bubble, and they don't really exist outside of that, which is again why we saw such a fierce backlash, particularly in the west of Ireland, because what we have is this imposition of ideas from Dublin, from a very select group of individuals from these organisations, imposed on Joe Public. And to be honest with you, it feels very, for many people, and people I talked to back home, it feels very clearly like, colonial times. It feels very much like imposition from an external force in Dublin, telling people how they're going to live and what they're going to do, whether they like it or not.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of fits into another part of your analysis that I thought was interesting in terms of conflicts that could arise, is the Irish economic model. Now, we in Britain are kind of taught to think that the Irish economy is, like a tiger, as you said before, the Celtic tiger, hugely successful, doing way better than us. We're terrible for leaving the EU. Look, we could be like Ireland if we just lowered our corporation tax and stayed pliant with Brussels. But actually, when you look at it, I think you said it was 40% of working young people are living at home with their parents. And
exactly,
meanwhile, the Irish elite are importing an elite from India who are taking the highest paid jobs, and then they're importing, unskilled asylum seekers at the bottom of the rung and squeezing the people in the middle. I wonder if you could talk about how that could play out in terms of resentment amongst communities.
Well spotted. There's this dual pressure. Exactly right. So we've just to reiterate or what you said there about this at the bottom rung, that because of this reckless government policy of essentially open doors over 25 years, which has completely overstrained all of our resources, the government has been buying from private stock social housing, which is then going to house immigrants. So this is at one end of the housing spectrum, let's say. But at the other end, and this is quite unique to Ireland, so since the late 1960s, Ireland became heavily reliant on this foreign direct investment model, but from the United States in particular. So it started mainly with pharmaceuticals, and that wasn't a problem for us actually, because we're quite well known for having extremely well educated science graduates. I think that's something we can be rightly proud of in Ireland. But then they started to shift more from up until 1996, in fact, things went pretty well. And then we hit full employment. But instead of cooling down, what the government did, the two big ones, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, is that they just put it on steroids. They realised, hey, this is a great way of balancing the books, or making it look like on paper that, we're doing a great job economically. So they completely abandoned domestic industry and they just put the foreign direct investment on steroids, essentially. And they particularly focused on big tech coming into Ireland from the 00s. And now the problem with that, and again, I got through the statistics, I break it all down, so, it's not just talk, is that Ireland has never produced tech graduates, just in general. So the statistics as we go through them show that, the various big tech courses have the highest dropout rates of any course in Ireland, for example. And that they are amongst the lowest enrolled in Ireland, for example. So what the government did was that they attracted significant investment from big tech US multinationals. Google, Meta, Amazon and so on are all headquartered in Dublin now. And these brought significant jobs with them, but we couldn't supply from our local stock. So what they did was overwhelmingly in the 90th percentile in many cases, employ from overseas and particularly India. And so what's happening is that we're importing this new upper middle class who are earning amongst the highest paychecks in the country, which means, of course, that they have their pick of houses in any urban area as well. So it looks that between big tech and medical jobs, that Indians are coming at a rate of about 2,000 per month to Ireland, which again for tiny Ireland is an extraordinary number, and that's down on top of 1 million people who were born elsewhere already living in Ireland. And so what's happening is, as you pointed out, we have this eating and eroding away of private stock by the government, vulture funds and others as well, but for social housing at one level to house migrants coming into the country. But then at the top end as well, we now have this upper middle class of Indians mainly who are able to have their pick of the private stock. And that's left your average Irish person, so your teachers, your whatever, they have no hope of buying property. We're now going through the worst housing crisis since the start of the state. You know, maybe you could argue that after our civil war, but it's the worst, in practical sense, it's the worst housing crisis in the history of the state. So 40%, as you pointed out, of young people up to the age of 35. So these are working young people, not unemployed, but 40% of working young people are living at home with their parents. They're in their parental home and have no hope of ever buying a house. You know, they are already doing everything right. They've gone to university, they've got a good job, they're working, but they can't buy a house. And again, this is down to government negligence, as you say, eating up the private stock. But what caused the initial shock to that system as well was that in 2004, when I was in university, the population of Ireland was around 4 million. Now it's 5.25 million, and nearly largely overseas immigration. So right now, just under 25% of everyone in Ireland was born overseas. And this happened in a space of 25 years. So there was no possible way that we could keep up with demand for housing stock. And on top of that, it's been very poorly managed by the government. But the victims of that are regular Irish people, young Irish people. So again, we're seeing a spike in immigration to Australia in particular and to Canada and America. There was a poll done by Eurofound, which is an EU affiliated group, who found that 61% of all Irish people are planning to immigrate within 3 years or would like to immigrate. Now, this is way above and beyond the average for the EU. So while we're told constantly that we're as you Riley and correctly pointed out, that we're told that we're super rich and that, you know, you're told that you should be like Ireland. Well, this is the reality of it. The reality is that this supposed success that we have, it benefits the US multinationals who are squatting in Ireland for the tax breaks, and it benefits Indians who are coming in and doing a terrific job of earning well. But it's absolutely not benefiting regular Irish people, and it's going to have a catastrophic effect on demographics, on family formation, on relationship formation. I mean, you're sitting at home at age 35 in your childhood bedroom. I mean, this is depressing. You've done everything right. You've gone to college. You're doing your job. So, of course, what are your options? Something quite dark or emigrate?
Mm. And, you know, there are, I'm sure, many, a bit like in England, you know, this plays out with working class young people kind of being able to recognise where the issue comes from and to articulate it and to demand change. But what we see with the white middle classes a lot of the time is that they become radicalised for more of what's causing their problems, in my view anyway. Yep. And when we spoke on the side of the conference, you know, you said to me, you just don't recognise young Irish people anymore. And I have some young Irish people in my circle. And, you know, I believe that relations between our two countries had improved, that, you know, we saw each other as equals, and, you know, lots of English people, British people have Irish ancestry anyway. You know, we're an entwined people in many ways. Yeah. But one thing I've noticed is this virulent anti-Englishness come across these young people, and they blame us for everything, not their government, who are importing people who are undermining their economic positions.
It's you're right. I went, you know, when I go back now, I do find, and I talk to a certain cohort of Irish people. Okay, I come from rural West, so it's still pretty normal there, and people are still, you know, the Irish you would expect, relaxed, kind of have a balanced perspective on things. But the Irish education system, as kind of alluded to earlier, has been very strongly hijacked by social justice theory, particularly in the arts. again, I got sorry to keep saying it, but just so people know that I have the backup there and they can dig into it if they want. But I spent a chapter on this in the book talking about how social justice theory has really infiltrated Irish universities. And we're talking about the hardest left from, say, from the Ivy League colleges of America, the kind of stuff that's fiercely corrosive to the soul, I would say. A lot of our policy documents in education now, for example, speak about there's in universities, all the universities have to sign up to a compact which says that they commit to promoting an intersectional environment in their university. That we actually have a document that's in place called the National Action Plan Against Racism, which essentially says that if you're a student from a minority background, you can't fail. You just can't fail at a university course. But what this social justice theory does, and we've seen in other countries like in America, for example, where it's caused this incredible unrest, is that it gives people a great sense of victimhood. You have this hierarchy of victimhood, which again, just in very blunt terms, lays out the native white male as the enemy, and it elevates certain classes who are identified as victims of that society. So the thing is that while Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have been very politically successful in Ireland since the foundation of the state, Sinn Féin, who are a socialist Republican Party. You see, a lot of people think they're a nationalist Republican Party. They're not. They're a socialist Republican Party. I mean, they were training with Gaddafi in Libya in the 80s. So this is where this extreme solidarity with Palestine and all comes from. That what's happened is that there is this. You were correct to say that it had all died down somewhat, and we had this more maturing of relationships between Britain and Ireland. But there's this new generation who've come through the universities with this very ugly, I would say, social justice victim complex. Now, if that mingles with old grievances of colonialism between, that's a combustible and a toxic mix, and that's what you're seeing there, this grievance mixed with history. And it's absurd, because if you look at, say, a band like Kneecap, who are in the news regularly now, right? They're talking as if it's still 1975, they're talking as if, Ireland and Britain are in the midst of this, kinetic war and, going around with their ballot. They weren't even born when at the height of the Troubles. So what they're doing is that it's performative. They're taking the very real, because I grew up, and I was young, but I knew, I grew up seeing the horrors of the bombings and of the North, and the brutalities of British officers too. War is hell, right? That there's wrong on both sides. But that's what I saw, the reality of it, which does give you a more circumspect kind of a view on things. But none of these people saw that. They're all born post the Good Friday Agreement, and for them, it's this, like I say, this toxic mix of being brought up to be a victim and looking for something to be a victim about. And I look at Kneecap and their fans as the perfect example of that. But that's the Sinn Féin effect on Irish culture, that they were throughout the 1970s, because that war was going on, that people saw it was easy for Sinn Féin to bring traditional Irish Republicans, proper nationalists together, and to bury their socialist ideology behind that, their internationalist socialist tendencies. But that has now come to the fore in peacetime, and that has very much infected Irish society, and particularly amongst young people. It's what's turned us into the most radically left country in Western Europe.
And what are the sort of things, just for our audience's sake, the sort of things that these young people are saying about Britain? I would have thought it's in their memory that we contributed to the bailout after the Great Crash, and we're defending them from Russia at the moment. I mean, do they not see any of that? What are they saying about us?
See, again, if you were to step back and take this kind of mature view, all of this would be very, could end in a very productive conversation. But as I say, Sinn Féin have managed to narrow everything down to the north of Ireland to represent the relationship for the entire of the Republic with the UK. And it's very cynical, it's it's ideologically driven. Just as you will have seen this extraordinary black and white view of Palestine-Israel from Ireland, and you will see this extraordinary black and white view of Cuba now currently. Wherever there's this international socialist movement that's been going on and intensifying radical since the 1970s, Ireland is now the hub of that. And the cheerleaders of that are Sinn Féin. And for them to have the power, so to speak on behalf of those issues, they have to hold fast to the grievances that we have between our historical grievances between our countries. And so they don't want and they can't have any productive conversation because they need that grievance to exist to give them a moral authority to then be, to pontificate essentially on other international events. Because that's something you'll have noticed, I'm sure, is that when I was growing up, we understood we were a tiny nation and we were happy and comfortable with that. You know, we just said, we're this little rock out here in the west of Ireland. You know what? The rest of Europe is going nuts, importing X, Y, and Z. You know, they're having their conflicts. They're going, and we were perfectly happy. And we probably had a kind of a smug sense of, well, you know what? We didn't screw up like them. But then, boom, overnight, our two main government parties invited all of that chaos in. But Sinn Féin are the ones who profit off of that chaos and all of these clashes between new cultures because they have this pernicious ideology that plays people off of one another. And that has boosted their profile and given them the confidence then to go on and pontificate on the international scene. So that's something that's quite shocking and embarrassing to me is when I see Irish politicians out on the national scene. Like we had several politicians on that flotilla to Israel or to the Gaza Strip there last summer. And, you know, for me, it's that I just think, who do you think we are? You know, what do you think our role is on the national stage here? How about we focus on Irish affairs first and foremost? How about we focus on building up our own national economy instead of being over-reliant on foreign direct investment and with it mass migration? How about we focus on, and if we want to have a talk about the North, how about we focus on something, for example, it looks like there's a lot of talk now about unification in the North, and I suppose demographics, unless, of course, the new demographics change everything, but it looks like it'll swing towards unification. And so, you know, why aren't we having a mature conversation about that? Because the way Sinn Féin right now are leveraging the conversation in north of Ireland for our victimhood points, as I say, to underpin their international pontificating, well, it's going to lead to very real and dangerous problems in the future. Say, for example, let's just imagine, right, that there was unification in Ireland tomorrow. Well, there's still a massive Unionist and Protestant community in Northern Ireland. Well, what do you think is going to happen with those? Do you think that they're all just going to say, sure, Begara, we're Irish now, isn't it great? Like, you know, of course it's not. All of the anger and rage that the Republicans in the North felt towards being part of Britain, they're obviously going to, a certain percentage will feel about being members of the Republic of Ireland. And how's that going to play out? That's obviously going to be a massive risk of civil unrest in the future. But see, we don't want these conversations in Ireland anymore, just as we don't want rational conversations about mass migration or about the economy. Everything is performative. Right now, it feels very much like we're in an era of college level, university level politics. And I think that's innate with left-wing politics in general. And as Ireland has shifted further and further left, we're more interested in performative politics than actually taking care of the bread and butter stuff, which is getting that 40% of young people into a bloody house, which is making sure Irish people aren't, again, emigrating in record numbers, which is, again, stopping this mass immigration, which has already had catastrophic effects. Just earlier this week, on Monday, there was a case which was the first officially recorded case of Islamic terrorism in Ireland, where an individual set fire to Conor McGregor's pub in Dublin and stabbed a police officer. Now, there has been other cases of Islamic terrorism, but that's not been allowed to creep out by the Irish government and the media. But we're already just 25 years into this experiment, seeing the problems with mass immigration and with multiculturalism. But there's no appetite to have a discussion about these things. And as we spoke earlier, when parties do spring up, or individuals spring up to try and have those hard conversations, they are beaten down by the media, who are acting very literally in the interests of the government. They're labelled and they're shut down. So in Ireland right now, you can have any opinion you want, from centre-left to hard-left.
I think you raise a really interesting point that I think we've got a bit of a blind spot to, which is the radicalisation of the Irish and how that could be used to foment tensions in Northern Ireland. I just don't think that's something that we've even really thought about.
Yeah.
But if we circle back to how we kind of started, you've laid out that, the way the Irish economy works, the lack of political representation, the tendency amongst the angry or the unfortunate to just, up sticks and leave, kind of all contribute to this idea that, the Irish probably might not demand the representation that they deserve. So if they don't, and the political elite carries on careering down the road that it is, how do you see Ireland in 10, 15 years?
Well, I've seen already, and this again to me is, it's impossible to, it would have been impossible to imagine 15 years ago, that there are groups. I've seen online that there are now dissident right groups who are out in the woods, literally training. There's a certain section of a cohort of people there who have completely given up on democracy. You'll often hear the refrain like that, there's no political solution. Well, there is a certain, I would say still small, group of people who absolutely believe that and who are preparing, radicalising, getting ready for civil conflict. What I think, and again it's a bit of a blind spot for people, is that just talking there about Sinn Féin and how they've self-radicalised and their whole ideology is built on victimhood. It's an extremely dangerous thing, because we saw at the end of January, there was the Orchard pub in County Cavan. There was an event being held there by a bunch of, it turned out they were Eastern Europeans, I think a couple were Belarusian, but a bunch of young lads were in a pub and they had a private event. They hired out the pub and they were kind of like meme lords, I suppose is the best way you could put it. They had an event and they put up some Israeli flags and some other flags, and it was just banter as far as I'm aware and what's been reported. But the local Sinn Féin councillor decided to go down there with a bunch of heavies, party members, and bust that up. And he broke into the place, and there was this confrontation between. Thankfully, it was de-escalated. But he bust in saying that we want no fascists in County Cavan, and he called them, which I thought was pretty funny. What was it? Zionist neo-Nazis, and he said they had to get the Zionist neo-Nazis out. This is rural Ireland, County Cavan, this is nuts. But it's funny, but it's not funny, because this goes to the heart of the Sinn Féin ideology, which is that I would say that as bad as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are, and they're terrible, and we need to get past them, and we need to end them, quite frankly. But the only thing worse than them would be the opposition getting in. So this is the disaster, because Sinn Féin coming from, violence is in their DNA, and anti-democratic means are in their DNA, and they've shown it already there. And the more power they get, the more violent things will get in Ireland. Now, what's interesting is, because, as I say, they're in this phase of being able to pontificate, because they're so culturally dominant at the moment in Ireland, what he did there to burst into that private event and try and shut that down, that level of hubris, you see, Sinn Féin, if they get into power, anyone who disagrees with them, Sinn Féin are going to resort to tactics like that, in my opinion. That's their DNA. But what they don't understand is there's a huge amount of people, particularly in rural areas, who won't take that nonsense from them. So what's going to happen is what always happens. Think back to Weimar Germany, if you will, where an overconfident hard left starts pushing it too far and causes a reaction and a backlash. And that's something I could very clearly see happen in Ireland within 10 years. I do see Sinn Féin losing the run of themselves. I do see them hyped up on their own cultural victories, taking it too far and spiralling. And worse, if a right-wing populist group does spring up, I do expect that they and other micro-left parties will start campaigns of intimidation against them, and that could, of course, and will, of course, really sour the atmosphere in Ireland.
Okay, Owen, thank you so much for that conversation. I think you really enlightened us to what's going on in Ireland.
I
I
hope
think
so.
it's a front that we've never even really considered. So thank you so much for your time. And your book, Vandalising Ireland, that's available on Amazon?
Yeah, that's the best
Is
way
it?
to get it. And Amazon, particularly there in Britain, you can get it on Amazon.
Okay. Well, thank you for watching GB News Originals. I am doing a piece on the conference that we've spoken about, so look out for that on YouTube.